The ballroom of the Celeste Grand Hotel was a spectacle of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, casting reflections on champagne glasses raised in forced toasts. Conversations flowed, rehearsed and calculated, each word a carefully placed move in Hollywood's never-ending game of power. This was a gathering of elites, directors, producers, actors and media figures, all here to celebrate a night of so-called progress. But in reality, it was just another night of masked egos and silent battles. Keanu Reeves entered without making an announcement. No entourage, no grand entrance, just quiet confidence in a well-tailored black suit. His silver crucifix hung loosely around his neck, swaying subtly as he walked. Unlike the other guests, he wasn't here to impress. He wasn't flashing an expensive watch or positioning himself for the next big deal. He simply existed in the space, detached from the chaos around him. Some noticed him immediately, acknowledging him with nods or whispered exchanges, but most continued their conversations, too wrapped up in their own importance. Across the room, Dylan Carter swirled the whiskey in his glass, his sharp eyes locked onto Keanu. He had been waiting for this moment. Dylan wasn't just any journalist. He was a rising star in progressive media, known for his ruthless takedowns of public figures. His targets never saw him coming until it was too late. Tonight he had his sights set on Keanu. Not because of a scandal, not because of a political stance, but because of something far more dangerous: his silence. Keanu Reeves was an anomaly in Hollywood. He didn't fit the mold of the loud activist or the outspoken rebel. He carried himself with an old-school dignity, refusing to bow to the ever-shifting tides of industry expectations. But Dylan had found an angle, one small detail that no one else seemed to question: the crucifix. A silver cross, worn openly in an industry that prided itself on leaving behind outdated traditions. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but to Dylan it was a challenge, and he intended to expose whatever Keanu was hiding behind it. The golden clock above the grand piano struck 10 p.m. Dylan saw his opportunity. Keanu stood alone near a marble pillar, quietly observing the room. He wasn't avoiding anyone, but he wasn't seeking attention either. Perfect. Dylan downed the rest of his whiskey, adjusted his suit and started walking toward him. His phone was already recording in his hand. This wasn't just an interview, it was an ambush. "Keanu," Dylan called out, his tone warm, friendly, almost disarming. "Mind if I ask you a quick question?" Keanu's dark eyes met his. He tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the man in front of him. A small nod, always polite, always composed. Dylan smiled, but his eyes gleamed with something sharper. He had played this game before. He knew exactly how to corner his targets. He took a breath and struck. "You've always positioned yourself as someone progressive," Dylan said, his voice loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "But don't you think wearing a crucifix at an event like this is a little outdated?" A brief silence. Heads turned, conversations paused. The energy in the room shifted, as if everyone had just realized something interesting was about to happen. Keanu didn't react immediately. No frown, no surprise, just stillness, as if he had already seen this move coming. Dylan felt the tension build in the air. "Good." He pressed forward. "I mean, Hollywood is evolving," he continued, now fully in control of the moment. "Religious symbols, especially ones tied to certain beliefs, carry controversial meanings. Don't you think it's time to leave them in the past?" More silence. The weight of the question hung between them. A few guests exchanged glances, waiting to see how Keanu would respond. In the corner, a young actress smirked slightly, amused by the spectacle. But Keanu? He simply blinked, slow and deliberate, his breathing steady, his fingers resting lightly on the rim of his untouched wineglass. Unshaken. And for the first time that night, Dylan felt something unexpected: doubt. Dylan felt the silence stretch longer than he expected. He had seen actors fumble under pressure, stumble over their words, desperately trying to craft the perfect answer that wouldn't offend anyone. But Keanu, he wasn't reacting the way he should. Instead of scrambling for a response, Keanu simply stood there, unbothered. His expression unreadable. His presence unnervingly calm, like a man who had nothing to prove. Dylan didn't like that. He needed a reaction. He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as if he had already won. "Look, I'm just saying," he continued, making sure his voice carried, "we're in a different time now. Hollywood is about progress, about moving forward. Religious symbols, especially ones with, let's just say, complicated histories, don't exactly fit into that future. So tell me, Keanu, what message are you trying to send by wearing that cross?" The question landed like a challenge. People nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. A few held their drinks mid-sip, their curiosity now fully captured. This was the moment. The trap was set. But Keanu still didn't take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, considering Dylan. And then, with the same composed ease, he finally spoke. "Tell me, Dylan." Keanu's voice was smooth, deliberate. "Since when did believing in something become a problem?" The shift was subtle, but immediate. The weight of the conversation had flipped in an instant, and now Dylan was the one caught off guard. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some exchanged quick glances, others smirked knowingly. Dylan felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He quickly forced a grin. "Oh, come on, Keanu," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "That's not what I meant. I'm not saying faith is a problem, but the cross, you know what it represents. It's been tied to oppression, controversy. Do you really think it reflects who you are?" There. He had said it. The word oppression. A powerful trigger. If Keanu defended the cross, Dylan could spin it as an outdated stance. If he backed down, it would be a quiet surrender. Either way, Dylan could control the narrative. It was the perfect corner. At least, it should have been. But Keanu, he simply let another brief silence settle between them. And then, with the ease of a man who had seen this all before, he responded, "Faith doesn't oppress, Dylan. People oppress." Dylan felt the words land like a sharp cut, not defensive, not aggressive, just truth. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone discreetly nodded. Another guest, a well-known director, leaned in slightly, suddenly interested in where this was going. Dylan, however, felt his grip on the conversation slipping. He needed to regain control, fast. So this time, he pushed harder. "With all due respect, Keanu," he said, his voice carrying a forced politeness, "wearing that crucifix at a Hollywood event is like saying we're stuck in the past. We're evolving. Do you really think religious symbols still have a place in modern society?" His tone was no longer casual. This was the final move. He had been patient. He had circled his target. And now he was forcing Keanu into a direct confrontation. This was where most people cracked, but Keanu just smirked. A small, effortless smile, like a man who had already won. And then he spoke. "Do you think kindness, hope, and love have become obsolete?" Dylan felt his stomach drop. He had just lost the room. The air in the ballroom had shifted. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something heavier. A quiet tension that made every guest, every onlooker, hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Dylan felt it too. The way the crowd had subtly turned against him. The way Keanu's words had left him exposed instead of the other way around. But he couldn't back down now. Not in front of everyone. He forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "That's not what I'm saying, Keanu," he said, trying to reclaim his footing. "Of course, kindness, hope, and love are important. But symbols, they change. They evolve. And some carry too much baggage. Isn't it better to leave certain things behind?" Keanu simply raised an eyebrow. He wasn't in a rush to answer. And that silence, that unbearable, controlled silence, was breaking Dylan more than any argument could. Dylan swallowed, his fingers tightening around his whiskey glass. He had to turn this around, fast. So, he did something riskier. He got personal. "You know, Keanu," he said, lowering his voice just slightly, making it seem as though he was offering some kind of understanding. "People from your generation, they had it easy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Too far, even Dylan could feel it, but he had already committed. It's easy to talk about faith, Dylan continued, his tone sharper now, when you've never had to fight for anything. The second the words left his mouth, time seemed to stop. Keanu's expression didn't change, not at first, but something in the way he stood, in the way his fingers lightly tapped against the rim of his glass, shifted. A barely noticeable reaction, but one that sent a wave of tension through the entire room. Someone in the back gasped softly. A veteran director shook his head. An actress who had been smirking moments ago suddenly looked uncomfortable. Everyone knew. Dylan had just made a huge mistake. For the first time that night, Keanu's posture adjusted slightly. He didn't lean forward, he didn't raise his voice, but there was something in his presence now, something heavier, something unshakable. He took a slow breath, set his glass down on the nearby table, and looked Dylan straight in the eyes. Easy? Keanu repeated the word, as if tasting it. Dylan felt something twist in his gut, something uneasy. Keanu let the silence stretch, just long enough for it to hurt. And then, finally, he spoke. I've been rejected in more auditions than you can count. The crowd fell dead silent. Keanu's voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. I've slept on borrowed couches because I couldn't afford rent. Dylan's throat went dry. I've lost people I loved, Keanu continued. His voice was calm, steady, but there was weight behind it now. My best friend died of an overdose. The woman I loved was killed in a car accident. My daughter died before she was even born. A gasp, somewhere in the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Dylan turned pale. He didn't know. He hadn't researched that part of Keanu's life. He had only seen the successful actor, the man adored by Hollywood and audiences worldwide. He had no idea about the weight Keanu carried. Keanu exhaled softly. And then, with the kind of certainty that couldn't be faked, he delivered the final blow. You think faith kept me standing because my life was easy? Dylan felt the eyes of the entire room on him now. No, Dylan. Keanu's voice was like a quiet storm. Faith kept me standing because my life was hard. And with that single sentence, Dylan Carter lost everything. The weight of Keanu's words settled over the room like a storm cloud. No one moved. No one spoke. It wasn't just a response. It was a reckoning. Dylan felt the blood drain from his face. He had walked into this thinking he controlled the conversation, thinking he had found a weak spot to exploit. But now, he was the one exposed. He forced himself to recover, to keep his expression neutral. He couldn't let Keanu have the last word. With a quick breath, he straightened his shoulders and let out a half-hearted chuckle. Look, Keanu, he said, his voice just a little weaker than before. I respect that. I really do. But let's be honest. Hollywood has changed. Public figures need to be aware of what they represent. Wearing that cross, whether you mean to or not, it sends a message. Keanu tilted his head slightly. And what message do you think it sends, Dylan? Dylan felt the question cut through him. He wasn't expecting Keanu to flip the burden of explanation back onto him. Well, Dylan hesitated, but only for a second. It's divisive. People look at you, they see that, and they think you're taking a stance, maybe against them. Keanu took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, unbothered. Then, setting the glass down gently, he asked, and who exactly is them? Dylan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because suddenly, he didn't know how to answer. It was such a simple question, such an obvious reversal. And yet, in this moment, in front of this crowd, Dylan realized that no matter what he said next, he was about to step on a landmine of his own making. His throat felt tight. His carefully rehearsed tactics, his ability to push people into corners, had just been used against him. Somewhere in the crowd, a guest smirked, recognizing the shift. Another leaned in slightly, sensing Dylan's growing discomfort. Keanu, however, stayed as he was, relaxed, poised, the faintest hint of amusement in his dark eyes. He didn't need to attack. He had already won. Dylan felt his grip tighten on his whiskey glass. He wasn't going to let this happen. So he did something reckless. He doubled down. "You're avoiding the point," Dylan snapped, his voice sharper than before, a little too desperate. "People like you, celebrities, when you wear something like that, it means something. You don't get to act like it doesn't. That's not how the world works." Keanu studied him for a moment, and then softly, with absolute clarity, he said, "Dylan, do you need the world to tell you what to believe?" Dylan flinched. The crowd reacted instantly. A murmur, a subtle shift in energy. Because that question, it wasn't just for Dylan anymore. It was for everyone. And in that moment, Dylan Carter knew he had just lost control of the entire conversation. For the first time that night, Dylan felt truly cornered. Not by an aggressive attack, not by some calculated strategy, but by a question he couldn't answer. His fingers curled around his whiskey glass, his mind racing for a way to recover. He had to flip the power dynamic back in his favor, so he forced a smirk, acting like Keanu's words didn't shake him. "That's cute," he said, trying to sound casual. "But come on, Keanu, let's not pretend you're some rebel fighting against the system. If you really believe in something, why don't we ever hear you talking about it? Why do you hide what you believe in?" A chill ran through the room. Dylan had changed his approach. This wasn't about the cross anymore. This was a direct attack on Keanu's integrity. Keanu's expression didn't change, but the atmosphere did. Dylan had just made his final move. And it was a mistake. Keanu let a brief pause settle, a silence more powerful than any argument. Then, with quiet confidence, he asked, "Who said I'm hiding it?" Dylan blinked. Keanu continued, his voice calm but firm. "Talking about something all the time doesn't mean you believe in it more. It just means you want other people to know you believe." The words landed with precision, not just on Dylan, but on everyone listening. Dylan felt his stomach twist. He had no comeback. Keanu took a small step forward, not aggressive, not intimidating, just certain. "My faith isn't a speech, Dylan. It's not a strategy. And it's definitely not a performance I put on every time someone demands I prove something." Dylan swallowed hard. He could feel the energy in the room turning against him. Completely. Keanu let the weight of his words settle before delivering the final blow. Faith isn't meant to be displayed. It's meant to be lived. Silence. Then, a shift, a murmur, a subtle nod from an older director, a producer whispering to his colleague. Even some of the younger actors who had been waiting for a show now looked impressed. And Dylan, he had nothing left. He had played every card, set every trap, and yet, he was the one left standing in the spotlight, exposed. His phone was still recording, capturing his own downfall in real time. Somewhere in the crowd, someone muttered, "Damn." Keanu. He simply took a slow sip of his wine, completely at ease. Like none of this had ever been a fight to begin with. Dylan, gripping his glass tighter, knew he had lost, and worse, he knew everyone else knew it too. Dylan's throat felt dry. His pulse pounded in his ears. He had come here expecting to humiliate Keanu Reeves in front of Hollywood's elite, to catch him off guard, to force him into a moment of weakness. But instead, he was the one unraveling. He could feel the weight of the silence around him, the unspoken judgment in the way people stared. Just minutes ago, he had been the one controlling the conversation, directing the attention, leading the audience. Now he was drowning in it. His fingers tightened around his phone. The recording, maybe he could edit it, twist the words, spin the narrative. He had done it before. A few cuts here, a headline there, and suddenly, Keanu wasn't the wise, unshakable man. He was just another out-of-touch celebrity. But before he could even start forming his escape plan, Keanu looked at him again, not with anger, not with superiority, with something worse, compassion. And that unsettled Dylan more than anything else that had happened tonight. Keanu set his glass down on the table beside him, adjusting his suit with quiet ease. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even concerned with what just happened. And then, he sealed Dylan's fate. Having faith doesn't mean avoiding hard questions, Keanu said, his voice steady, measured. It means knowing who you are, even when everyone around you tries to change you. Dylan felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck. Keanu gave a small, effortless smile, the kind that told Dylan this conversation was already over, and then with a final glance he added, "And I know exactly who I am, Dylan. Do you?" Boom. It was over. Dylan's breath caught in his throat. His fingers twitched around his phone, but there was nothing left to say. No move left to play. He had lost, completely. The room, once buzzing with polite conversation and whispered speculation, was now charged with something different. Dylan could feel it. The way people were looking at him now, not with admiration, not even with curiosity, with indifference. And in Hollywood, that was worse than hatred. A well-known producer murmured something to his assistant and turned away. An actress who had been watching with intrigue moments ago was now more interested in her drink. Conversations slowly resumed, but no one looked at Dylan anymore. Because Dylan Carter no longer mattered. Keanu, meanwhile, simply turned away, unbothered. He resumed a quiet conversation with an old friend, chuckled at a passing joke, raised his glass in a casual toast. Anyone looking at him now would have never guessed he had just walked away from a public confrontation, because for Keanu, there had never been a war to win. And that was what humiliated Dylan the most. His phone vibrated in his hand. He glanced down. Trending topic: Keanu destroys reporter on live video. Dylan's stomach dropped. He clicked on it. The clips were already online. Multiple angles, different recordings. People had been filming the entire conversation, and the comments, brutal. The journalist tried to take down Keanu, but Keanu didn't even need to lift a finger. Dylan Carter getting obliterated in real time. He's never recovering from this. Did this guy seriously think he could take on Keanu? Amateur move. That part where Keanu says faith isn't meant to be displayed, it's meant to be lived. Damn. Dylan just lost at life, man. This guy's going to disappear for a while. Dylan's chest tightened. This was worse than losing the conversation. This was career suicide. His reputation, his entire brand, was built on tearing people down. But tonight, he had been the one exposed. Across the room, Keanu never even glanced at him. He didn't need to. Dylan had been defeated by a man who never even tried to fight. And that was a humiliation he would never recover from.